Before the first block was ever carved, before the desert horizon was broken by the peak of a monument, there was only silence and a vision that defied nature. You are standing on the Giza Plateau 4,500 years ago. The air is thick with the scent of heated limestone and the sound of 1,000 men breathing in unison. What you've been told about how these giants were built is only half the story. The truth isn't just in the stone, it's in the invisible geometry and the blood of an ambition so vast it aimed to touch the stars themselves. Let's peel back the layers of time. Let's witness the birth of eternity. If you are listening to my stories right now, I wonder, where in the world are you joining me from? Perhaps in the quiet of the night, or amidst the rush of the day. Wherever you are welcome here. But before we step further into the shadows of this enigma, if you are a soul drawn to the whispers of the past and the mysteries the world forgot, you have found your sanctuary. Join our growing circle of seekers by subscribing to Dreamy Old Stories. Together, let us journey into the depths of history where the truth remains hidden and every story carries a secret. Welcome back. This is Dreamy Old Stories, and today we uncover a tale that was never meant to be told. Long before the pyramids stood above the desert, the plateau at Giza stretched outward in pale shades of stone and sand beneath a broad Egyptian sky. The land carried rough layers of exposed limestone, where the earth rose gently above the nearby Nile Valley. Thin trails crossed the dry ground where travelers and workers had passed in earlier seasons, though no heavy monument yet interrupted the horizon. Low ridges of broken rock collected around shallow depressions where wind had slowly pushed dust across the surface over many years. In the early light, the plateau appeared wide and open, touched by a soft yellow brightness that slowly spread across the uneven earth as morning approached from the eastern horizon. The air above the plateau carried a dry warmth even before midday arrived. Fine grains of sand moved lightly against exposed skin and gathered quietly inside folds of linen clothing worn by small groups of surveyors standing far from the riverbank. The faint smell of heated stone mixed with traces of smoke drifting from distant cooking fires near temporary camps below the ridge. Sandals pressed against brittle ground that cracked softly beneath careful steps. Sometimes a warm breeze passed through the area, carrying loose dust into the air, briefly clouding the sharp outlines of the hills before settling again along the pale surface. Far away, the Nile reflected sunlight in narrow flashes that shimmered through the desert haze. As the sun climbed higher, the empty plateau slowly became a place of observation and preparation. Men carrying wooden poles and coiled measuring ropes walked across the uneven ground, while others paused to study the position of shadows stretching beside planted stakes. Small marks appeared across the limestone, where tools scraped lines into the rock with deliberate care. A worker climbed partway up a ridge to gain a clearer view toward the horizon, while another poured water into a shallow trench to test the levelness of the earth. Voices occasionally drifted across the open space, though long periods passed where movement alone guided the activity. The plateau gradually shifted from untouched land into a place where human attention had begun shaping future intentions. For those standing upon the high ground, the plateau may have carried a feeling larger than ordinary labor. The open desert created a sense of distance that separated the workers from crowded villages near the Nile. Above them, the sky expanded without obstruction, and the slow movement of the sun across that vast space encouraged careful thought about order, direction, and permanence. Some men may have looked across the empty land and imagined structures that did not yet exist, except as ideas carried quietly inside the mind. Others perhaps felt uncertainty while staring across the bare stone, aware that countless days of work still rested ahead. The plateau offered no answers yet, only space, silence, heat, and the first careful measurements of an enormous human ambition. By the second half of the morning, the color of the plateau had begun to shift beneath the stronger sunlight. The pale stone that earlier carried a cool gray tone now reflected a brighter shade that almost forced the eyes to narrow when looking across open ground. Thin cracks spread through sections of exposed limestone like faint lines on dry skin. In scattered places, loose fragments of rock rested beside darker patches where ancient pressure had broken the surface long before any builders arrived. The plateau rose above the fertile river plain with a quiet separation, leaving the green life near the Nile behind and surrounding the high ground with the harder textures of desert earth and weathered stone. The growing heat slowly changed the experience of standing upon the plateau for long periods of time. Linen cloth around the shoulders absorbed sweat and became heavier against the body, while dry air pulled moisture from the mouth and throat. Workers occasionally paused beside clay jars placed beneath rough shelters made from stretched fabric and wooden supports. Water carried a faint mineral taste after resting for hours beneath the warming air. Dust clung to hands dampened by sweat and settled beneath fingernails after repeated contact with ropes, tools, and rough limestone surfaces. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a donkey released a tired cry that briefly carried across the open land before fading into the larger quiet surrounding the surveyors and their measured activity. Near the center of the plateau, small groups continued adjusting their positions as the movement of the sun altered the direction of shadows cast across the ground. A man holding a weighted line stood motionless, while another carefully repositioned a wooden marker several steps away. Nearby, two workers lowered themselves onto the stone and pressed their palms against the earth as if feeling for unevenness hidden beneath the surface. The rhythm of activity unfolded gradually rather than quickly. A tool dropped against limestone produced a sharp sound that echoed briefly before disappearing into open space. Birds circled high overhead where rising warm air carried them slowly upward above the plateau, tracing quiet patterns across the brightness of the sky. For some among the surveyors, the work may have carried a strange balance between ordinary effort and distant expectation. Their hands dealt with practical things, such as rope fibers, stone surfaces, and measured distances. Yet the purpose behind these actions reached far beyond the present day. The empty plateau encouraged thoughts that moved toward the future rather than the immediate moment. Men standing there could already sense that the land itself was beginning to receive human intention, even though no massive structure had yet appeared. Beneath the sunlight and drifting dust, the first invisible outlines of the pyramids existed only within calculations, memory, and imagination, waiting quietly inside the minds of those who studied the desert horizon with patient attention. Toward midday, the sunlight settled heavily across the plateau and softened the distant outlines of the desert beyond Giza. Heat rising from the limestone created a faint trembling effect above the ground, causing faraway ridges to appear slightly blurred at their edges. Small clusters of darker stone interrupted the pale surface, where ancient fragments had broken away from the bedrock over many centuries. In some areas, the earth dipped gently into shallow hollows, where loose sand collected in uneven shapes shaped by seasonal winds. The plateau no longer looked empty in a simple way. Subtle marks of preparation had begun spreading across the landscape through footprints, scraped lines, disturbed dust, and carefully placed measuring points. The stronger heat changed the sounds carried through the open air. Conversations became shorter as workers saved energy beneath the weight of the afternoon sun. Breathing grew more noticeable during physical effort, especially when men carried bundles of poles or dragged heavier tools across rough ground. Dry wind brushed against exposed skin with a texture that felt warm rather than refreshing. Some workers wrapped additional linen around their heads to shield their faces from blowing sand that occasionally lifted into the air in brief swirling motions. The smell of sun-heated limestone became sharper during these hours, blending with traces of sweat, rope fibers, and smoke drifting from small cooking fires where meals were slowly prepared near the lower camps beside the plateau. A gradual pattern of movement continued unfolding across the work area as surveyors adjusted their methods to the changing position of the sun. One group stood gathered around a shallow trench filled with water, while another carefully stretched rope between wooden stakes hammered into the ground earlier that morning. A younger worker climbed onto a higher section of exposed rock, carrying a simple sighting tool made from wood and cord. Nearby, an older surveyor paused to study the horizon in silence before making a small correction to the alignment of markers placed across the plateau. Time moved through action rather than through spoken announcement. Each measured step and repeated observation slowly added precision to plans that existed only as invisible geometry spread across the desert floor. Somewhere within these quiet preparations, a deeper awareness may have begun forming among those involved in the work. The plateau demanded patience because the land offered no immediate reward for hurried effort. Every line drawn into the limestone represented trust in something that could not yet be seen completed. Men standing beneath the broad sky may have sensed the unusual scale of the task waiting ahead, though the future remained impossible to fully imagine from the empty ground surrounding them. The wide desert created space for reflection as much as labor. Looking across the plateau, they may have felt both small beneath the immense sky and strangely connected to an undertaking intended to outlast generations not yet born. As afternoon slowly deepened across the plateau, the angle of sunlight began revealing textures hidden during the brighter hours of midday. Long surfaces of limestone showed faint ridges and shallow grooves where ancient layers of sediment had hardened into stone over unimaginable stretches of time. Loose pebbles cast narrow shadows across the ground, while patches of sand gathered beside exposed rock in soft curved patterns shaped by the wind. Far beyond the plateau, the Nile Valley carried a muted green tone beneath the dusty horizon, creating a distant contrast against the dry elevation where the surveyors worked. The high ground seemed separated from ordinary life below, as though the plateau belonged to a quieter world of stone, sky, and measured distance. The changing light also altered the physical feeling of the place. The harsh pressure of midday heat gradually softened, though warmth still rose steadily from the ground through the soles of worn sandals. Some workers sat briefly beneath rough shade coverings, eating coarse bread and dates, while dust settled slowly along their clothing and arms. Clay jars passed from hand to hand as men drank carefully rationed water warmed by the long afternoon sun. Nearby, rope fibers scraped against rough skin, while tools carried the dry metallic scent of heated copper. The wind shifted direction several times, carrying cooler currents from the river, before fading again into warmer desert air that brushed across the plateau in slow, uneven waves. Work continued with quieter concentration during these later hours. Surveyors walked measured distances while counting softly beneath their breath, careful not to lose track of calculations repeated many times throughout the day. The small stones were arranged into temporary markers across the ground, forming lines that only the workers themselves fully understood. A man crouched beside a shallow cut in the limestone and brushed loose dust aside with the palm of his hand before carving another narrow mark into the surface. Nearby, two assistants repositioned a wooden frame used for observing shadows cast by the descending sun. The plateau gradually became covered with signs of organized effort, though from a distance, the activity still appeared small against the enormous openness surrounding the workers. For those who paused long enough to look outward across the plateau, the passing hours may have carried an unusual sense of scale. The movement of the sun transformed the land slowly, reminding the surveyors that their work depended not only on human skill, but also on careful attention to time itself. Each shadow stretching across the stone offered information that could guide future construction long after the measurements of this single day were complete. The workers may not have spoken often about permanence, yet the idea likely existed quietly beneath their actions. Standing there among scattered tools and unfinished markings, they occupied a brief human moment within a landscape that seemed prepared to witness centuries beyond their own lives. Late afternoon brought softer colors across the plateau as the sunlight lowered toward the western desert. The bright pale stone gradually turned warmer in tone, carrying shades of gold and faded amber across the uneven ground. Long shadows from ridges and scattered markers stretched farther over the limestone surface, dividing sections of the plateau into alternating bands of light and shade. Small clouds of dust occasionally lifted behind moving workers before dissolving into the dry air above the high ground. In the distance, narrow strips of cultivated land near the Nile appeared darker beneath the changing sky, while the plateau itself seemed suspended between the fertile river world and the wide, empty desert reaching beyond the horizon. The cooling air slowly eased the physical strain carried through the hotter hours of the day. Breathing became less heavy during movement, and workers loosened linen coverings wrapped around their heads and shoulders. The smell of dust remained present, though evening moisture beginning to gather near the river softened the sharper dryness that filled the plateau earlier. Sand shifted quietly beneath tired footsteps as groups crossed the uneven ground carrying tools back toward temporary camps. Somewhere nearby, a small cooking fire released the scent of burning wood mixed with roasting grain. Faint sounds drifted upward from lower areas near the Nile where animals, distant voices, and wooden boats continued their ordinary routines beneath the fading sunlight. The pace of activity changed as surveyors prepared to end the day's measurements. Some workers collected stakes and cords while others inspected markings cut into the limestone to ensure they would remain visible after nightfall. One man carefully wrapped measuring ropes into tight coils to protect them from twisting or damage. Nearby, several assistants stood beside a shallow trench of water, watching how the lowered sunlight reflected across its surface before recording final observations. The plateau carried fewer sharp sounds now. Tools struck stone less frequently, and movement unfolded with slower gestures shaped by fatigue and growing evening calm. Even the wind seemed to travel differently across the high ground as the heat of the day gradually released itself into the open desert sky. For many upon the plateau, the approach of evening may have encouraged quieter thoughts than those carried during active labor. The empty land surrounding them no longer appeared untouched. Though no visible monument yet stood there, human intention had already settled into the ground through countless careful actions repeated across the day. Looking across the marked limestone and scattered survey points, some workers may have sensed that they were participating in the earliest stage of something that would eventually grow beyond individual memory. The plateau still held silence and open space, yet beneath that calm surface lay the beginning of a design meant to connect earthly labor with ideas of endurance, power, and the distant hope of permanence beneath the stars. As evening settled fully across the plateau, the final warmth of sunlight lingered briefly upon the exposed limestone before slowly fading into softer shades of gray and muted brown. The ridges and shallow depressions scattered across the high ground became less distinct as darkness gathered over the desert. Far to the west, the horizon carried a dim red glow that gradually weakened with each passing moment. Small fires near temporary camps flickered against the growing night, their light touching nearby tools, baskets, and clay jars before disappearing again into shadow. The plateau, which earlier held movement and measured activity, now opened itself to the cooler breath of evening and the immense quiet stretching across the desert. The air felt different after sunset. Heat stored inside the limestone during the long day slowly escaped back into the night, creating gentle currents that moved across the ground and carried traces of smoke, dry earth, and distant river moisture. Workers resting near the camps wrapped linen cloth around their shoulders as temperatures gradually lowered beneath the open sky. The sounds of the plateau softened into smaller details. Quiet conversation drifted beside the fires while sandals scraped lightly against stone, and occasional gusts of wind stirred loose sand along the edges of the camp. Beyond the ridge, faint noises from the Nile Valley rose intermittently through the darkness, reminding those upon the plateau that ordinary life continued below, while the high desert entered a slower rhythm beneath the stars. Some surveyors remained awake after the others settled into rest. A few climbed higher sections of the plateau, carrying simple sighting tools and wooden markers, turning their attention upward toward the night sky. The first stars appeared gradually above the desert, faint at first, then sharper as darkness deepened across the horizon. Men studied the positions of these lights with careful patience, comparing their observations against remembered patterns passed through generations of Egyptian knowledge. One worker adjusted the placement of a marker beside a line scratched into stone earlier that day. Another stood silently beside him, watching the stars move almost imperceptibly across the sky, while cool wind traveled over the open plateau, where future structures still existed only as measurements and intention. For those standing beneath the vast night sky, the plateau may have felt less like an empty piece of land and more like a meeting place between Earth and something far beyond ordinary human life. The stars above Giza moved with steady order, encouraging the belief that the heavens themselves followed patterns that could guide human construction below. In that darkness, surrounded by scattered tools and unfinished markings, the future pyramids already possessed a quiet presence inside the imagination of the workers who studied the sky. Nothing immense yet rose from a plateau, yet the first foundation had already formed through observation, patience, memory, and belief. Long before stone blocks were lifted into place, the work had begun in silence beneath the stars of ancient Egypt. The plateau was no longer just sand and wind. It had become a canvas of human intention. But how do you align a mountain of stone to the North Star with nothing but shadows and rope? The answer lies in the precision of the surveyors, and a secret hidden in a simple trench of water. Across the broad plateau at Giza, the first signs of organized measurement appeared not as towering structures, but as small arrangements of rope, wood, and stone spread carefully across the pale ground. Wooden stakes stood upright at measured intervals where surveyors had pressed them deep into cracks within the limestone surface. Thin cords stretched between these markers, forming long straight lines that cut across the open desert in deliberate directions. Nearby, shallow trenches filled with water reflected the bright sky above, helping workers compare levels across uneven sections of earth. Simple tools rested beside the marked ground, including weighted lines, carved measuring rods, and smooth stones used for observing the movement of shadows throughout the day. The physical experience of this work unfolded slowly beneath the Egyptian sun. Surveyors crouched for long periods beside the trenches, while warm air drifted over their backs and shoulders. Fingers roughened by labor tightened and loosened rope fibers repeatedly during the careful process of alignment. Water carried a cool sensation against the skin when workers lowered their hands into shallow channels to test the flatness of the earth below. Dry dust settled across knees, sandals, and linen cloth, while sunlight reflected sharply from pale limestone into narrowed eyes. Around the work area, faint sounds gathered softly together. The scrape of wood against stone, quiet voices counting measured lengths, and the distant movement of wind across open ground blended into the rhythm of patient observation. As the hours passed, subtle adjustments gradually reshaped the arrangement of lines spread across the plateau. One surveyor shifted a wooden stake slightly after studying the angle of its shadow beside a stretched cord. Another stepped carefully backward across the marked ground while holding a measuring rod level against the horizon. Nearby, assistants poured additional water into a trench where the surface had lowered after soaking into dry soil beneath the limestone. Short pauses often followed these actions, while groups quietly compared distances and checked alignments from different positions across the plateau. Through many small corrections, the empty desert slowly transformed into an organized space where geometry and observation guided nearly every movement made by the workers. For the men carrying out these measurements, the work may have held meaning beyond ordinary construction. The careful alignment of ropes and shadows connected human effort with larger patterns observed in the natural world above them. Each straight line placed upon the plateau suggested a search for order beneath the enormous sky stretching across ancient Egypt. The workers likely understood that even slight errors could affect structures intended to endure far beyond their own lifetimes. Standing among marked stones and reflected sunlight, they participated in a quiet form of preparation that relied less on force and more on concentration, memory, and trust in methods repeated carefully across generations of Egyptian knowledge. By early morning, before the strongest heat reached the plateau, groups of surveyors had already returned to the marked ground carrying tools shaped by long practical use rather than decoration. Coiled ropes hung across their shoulders beside polished wooden rods marked with measured divisions cut carefully into the surface. Some workers carried plumb lines weighted with carved stone, while others transported shallow containers used for moving water into prepared trenches. Across the limestone, rows of stakes created temporary pathways that guided movement between measured points. The arrangement looked modest against the wide desert, yet each object served a precise purpose within the growing network of lines and angles slowly spreading across the plateau beneath the pale morning sky. The atmosphere surrounding the work carried a mixture of concentration and physical strain shaped by the desert environment. Cool air from the night still lingered faintly near the ground during the earliest hours, though warmth gradually rose with the climbing sun. Workers bent low beside measuring cords, while dust brushed against their hands and forearms during repeated adjustments. Water poured into narrow trenches released a faint earthy scent from the dampened soil, beneath the limestone surface. The texture of rope pressed into skin as men pulled cords tight between distant stakes to reduce sagging across long measured spans. Nearby, quiet breathing and the occasional tapping of wood against stone became more noticeable than conversation, as much of the labor depended upon careful observation rather than constant instruction. Throughout the morning, the marked landscape slowly evolved through repeated acts of correction and comparison. A surveyor standing near the center of the plateau lifted a weighted line into the air and watched how it settled beside a vertical stake. Several assistants repositioned markers after discovering a slight deviation in the spacing between measured points. Elsewhere, workers used reflected sunlight upon water surfaces to identify sections of uneven ground requiring further adjustment. Small groups crossed the plateau carrying fresh stakes to expand the measured area outward from earlier reference lines. The process moved gradually, shaped by patience rather than speed. Every alteration influenced the accuracy of future measurements, encouraging workers to proceed with deliberate attention through even the smallest stages of preparation. For many involved in this work, the act of measurement may have created a quiet awareness of balance between human intention and the larger world surrounding them. The surveyors depended upon sunlight, shadows, horizon lines, and the steady pull of gravity itself to guide their calculations. Their tools remained simple in appearance, yet those tools allowed them to shape order from open desert space with remarkable precision. Standing across the plateau among stretched cords and shallow water channels, the workers may have sensed that they were participating in something both practical and symbolic. The measured lines beneath their feet carried the first signs of permanence, long before stone walls and towering structures would rise into the Egyptian sky. As the sun climbed higher above the plateau, the measured lines crossing the limestone became more visible beneath the sharper light of late morning. Thin cords stretched across long distances with careful tension, their faint shadows falling diagonally over the pale ground. Small piles of stone marked important reference points, where surveyors repeatedly returned to confirm alignment. In several areas, shallow trenches filled with water reflected fragments of the bright sky, creating narrow bands of shimmering light across the dusty surface. Wooden siding frames stood upright beside marked lines, their simple shapes contrasting against the enormous openness surrounding the workers. From a distance, the plateau resembled a vast drawing slowly emerging across the desert through quiet acts of observation and adjustment. The physical demands of maintaining accuracy grew heavier as heat gathered across the high ground. Sunlight pressed against exposed skin, while warm air carried loose dust through the measured pathways between stakes and markers. Workers kneeling beside cords often wiped sweat from their faces before checking distances again with steady concentration. Water inside the trenches warmed beneath the afternoon brightness, and hands lowered into the channels no longer found the same cool relief felt earlier in the morning. Rope fibers roughened palms after hours of pulling, tightening, and repositioning measured lines across uneven stone. Even simple movements required effort beneath the growing heat, yet the workers continued carefully, knowing that precision depended upon patience carried through uncomfortable conditions. Subtle activity continued unfolding across the plateau as surveyors refined the expanding grid of measurements. A worker standing near a siding frame adjusted its position after studying the angle between two distant markers. Nearby, assistants removed a row of stakes and placed them again several hand lengths away to correct an earlier miscalculation discovered during comparison checks. Another group walked slowly along a stretched cord while counting measured intervals beneath quiet voices. At one trench, a surveyor crouched low to examine how reflected sunlight touched the water surface before signaling for additional adjustments farther along the line. Through these repeated actions, the measured space gradually gained greater order, each correction strengthening the invisible structure already taking shape across the empty plateau. For those engaged in this careful labor, the process of alignment may have encouraged a different understanding of time itself. The work could not be rushed without risking error, and every successful measurement depended upon repeated verification carried out over many hours beneath the changing sky. The surveyors may have sensed that the future stability of the pyramids rested partly upon these quiet moments of concentration taking place before any massive stone had been lifted into position. Their attention focused not upon grandeur, but upon balance, proportion, and direction. Standing among chords, shadows, and reflected light, they participated in a form of preparation where small human actions slowly shaped the foundation for structures intended to endure across distant centuries. By the middle of the afternoon, long sections of the plateau had become organized through a growing network of measured pathways and carefully aligned reference points. Stakes placed earlier in the day now formed visible rows stretching across the limestone in deliberate directions. Some lines followed the movement of the sun, while others related to distant points along the horizon studied by experienced surveyors. Narrow channels containing water crossed portions of the marked ground where workers continued testing level surfaces with patient attention. Nearby, wooden rods rested beside weighted cords and stone markers arranged in neat clusters upon the earth. Although the plateau still appeared mostly open and undeveloped, signs of human planning had begun settling into the landscape through these repeated acts of measurement. The atmosphere surrounding the workers carried the heavy warmth of late afternoon mixed with the dry scent of heated stone. Linen clothing darkened slightly with sweat after long hours spent bending, walking, and lifting tools across the plateau. Dust clung to ankles and settled into folds of fabric stirred by occasional desert wind moving through the marked work areas. Water poured into trenches released soft splashing sounds that briefly interrupted the quieter rhythm of counting and observation. Some workers paused to drink from clay jars before returning to their positions beside cords stretched tightly between distant stakes. The repetitive nature of the labor shaped a steady physical rhythm where attention moved continuously between the body, the tools, and the measurements unfolding across the plateau beneath the broad Egyptian sky. Small changes continued appearing as surveyors refined their calculations through repeated comparison. One group carefully shortened a measured line after discovering slight tension differences in the rope caused by the afternoon heat. Another surveyor studied the shadow cast by a vertical pole before marking a fresh point upon the limestone beside him. Nearby, assistants widened part of a trench to create a more stable water surface for level testing. A younger worker carried replacement stakes from a nearby supply area, while older surveyors reviewed earlier markings scratched into the stone during the morning hours. These adjustments unfolded gradually across the plateau, creating an atmosphere where progress emerged through careful correction rather than dramatic action or sudden transformation. For many among the workers, the process of measuring the plateau may have created a quiet sense of responsibility tied closely to memory and tradition. The methods guiding their actions had likely been taught through years of observation and practice, passed from experienced hands to younger generations, learning how to read shadows, distances, and horizon lines beneath the desert sky. every corrected angle and balanced measurement carried importance, because future construction would depend entirely upon these early decisions. The surveyors may have understood that the strength of the pyramids would begin not with stone itself, but with invisible precision established upon the empty ground. Their labor asked for restraint, patience, and trust in careful methods refined slowly across many seasons of Egyptian knowledge. As the afternoon light softened toward evening, the measured lines spread across the plateau became easier to follow with the eye. Shadows cast by wooden stakes stretched farther across the limestone, emphasizing the careful geometry laid upon the ground throughout the day. The bright glare that earlier covered the plateau faded into warmer shades of gold and pale orange, allowing small details to emerge more clearly along the marked surfaces. Scratched reference points cut into stone reflected narrow bands of light, while cords suspended between stakes created fine dark lines against the dusty earth. Around the work area, clusters of tools rested where workers had temporarily set them aside beside trenches, marker stones, and carefully arranged measuring rods used during the long hours of alignment. The physical atmosphere grew calmer as evening approached, though traces of the day's labor remained visible upon the workers themselves. Dust coated their sandals and gathered along the edges of linen garments worn beneath the desert heat. Hands carried faint impressions left by rope fibers pulled tight through repeated measurements. Cooler air drifting from the direction of the Nile brought slight relief after the stronger heat of midday, and some surveyors paused briefly beside the trenches where water reflected the changing colors of the sky above. The sound surrounding the plateau also shifted during these hours. Sharp strikes of tools against stone became less frequent, replaced by quieter movements, low conversation, and the soft brushing of wind passing over marked lines stretched across the ground. Work continued carefully despite growing fatigue. Surveyors moved slowly between distant markers while checking final alignments before darkness would make further adjustments difficult. One man knelt beside a cord and tightened its position against a row of stakes after noticing slight movement caused by shifting ground beneath the sand. Nearby, another worker carried a shallow bowl of water toward a trench where earlier evaporation had lowered the surface used for level observation. Small groups gathered at several reference points to compare measurements recorded throughout the day, occasionally making narrow scratches into the limestone to preserve important alignments for future work. Across the plateau, the process unfolded with deliberate patience shaped by awareness that accuracy required steady attention until the final light disappeared from the desert. For those engaged in these evening tasks, the measured landscape around them may have begun to feel less temporary than it first appeared. The cords, stakes, trenches, and markings represented more than simple preparation. Together they formed an invisible structure already organizing the future shape of the pyramids before a single monumental wall existed upon the plateau. Standing beneath the changing evening sky, the surveyors may have sensed that their careful observations connected earthly labor with something larger and more enduring. The alignment of stone with horizon, shadow, and star reflected a belief that order carried meaning beyond practical construction. Through patient measurement, the workers quietly prepared the ground for a monument intended to speak across generations, yet unknown. As night slowly approached the plateau, the last light of the sun settled low across the measured ground and revealed the full pattern of work completed throughout the day. Rows of stakes crossed the limestone in long straight paths, while stretched cords divided the open desert into carefully organized sections. Shallow trenches reflected dim evening color, before darkness gradually softened their outlines against the earth. Tools rested where workers had placed them beside marked reference points scratched into stone earlier that afternoon. The plateau carried a different appearance, now compared to the untouched landscape of previous days. Human intention had become visible through geometry, spacing, and alignment quietly spread across the high desert beneath the fading Egyptian sky. The atmosphere cooled steadily after sunset. Air moving across the plateau carried traces of dampness from the distant Nile mixed with the dry scent of limestone, still releasing stored heat from the long day. Workers returning toward temporary camps walked with slower steps shaped by physical exhaustion and prolonged concentration. Sand shifted softly beneath sandals, while quiet voices drifted through the evening air beside low fires beginning to glow near the edge of the work area. Some men washed dust from their hands using water saved carefully inside clay jars. Others sat beside stacked tools and stretched sore muscles after hours spent kneeling, lifting cords, and studying measurements beneath the harsh brightness of the desert sun. Even after many workers settled into rest, a smaller group remained active upon the plateau. Several experienced surveyors stood near important alignment points, watching the first stars emerge above the darkening horizon. One man adjusted a vertical pole, while another compared its position against a distant marker barely visible in the fading light. Nearby, assistants carried small oil lamps, whose flames flickered gently in the evening wind as final observations continued across the measured ground. The surveyors understood that certain alignments depended not only upon the movement of the sun, but also upon the steady patterns visible within the night sky. Their work extended beyond daylight hours, guided by careful attention to celestial order as much as earthly distance. For the men standing beneath the rising stars, the process of measurement may have carried a quiet emotional weight difficult to express openly. The lines arranged across the plateau represented more than technical preparation for construction. They reflected an effort to place human work into harmony with larger forces observed in nature, time, and the heavens above Egypt. Every measured angle and corrected distance expressed trust that order could outlast individual lives and passing generations. Looking across the marked limestone beneath the night sky, the surveyors may have sensed the beginning of something immense taking shape through patience rather than speed. Before stone towers rose above Giza, the pyramids first existed as balance, proportion, observation, and belief carefully placed upon the desert ground. The invisible lines were drawn. The geometry of the gods was set upon the earth. But geometry alone cannot build legend. To turn a dream into a fortress of stone, you need the raw, brutal power of the earth itself. Deep in the heart of the quarries, the real battle against time was about to begin. South of the rising pyramid grounds, the limestone quarries opened across the earth in wide layers of pale stone cut deep into the desert landscape. Steep walls surrounded the work areas where long rectangular channels had already been carved into the rock by earlier labor. Broken fragments of limestone covered the uneven ground beside unfinished blocks, resting partly separated from the quarry floor. Wooden sledges leaned against rough stone surfaces, while baskets filled with chipped debris stood near the edges of narrow pathways crossing the excavation site. Copper chisels, wooden mallets, and stone hammers lay scattered beside the workers, who moved carefully through the dusty quarry beneath the bright Egyptian sun. The quarry carried a heavy physical atmosphere shaped by heat, dust, and repeated sound. Fine limestone powder drifted through the air each time metal tools scraped against exposed rock, settling gradually onto skin, hair, and linen clothing already marked by labor. The dry scent of crushed stone mixed with sweat beneath the warmth of the afternoon sun. Workers felt rough vibration travel through their hands whenever hammer struck chisel against the quarry wall. Breathing often became shallow during long periods of cutting, as dust gathered around the mouth and nose. Across the excavation site, the steady rhythm of scraping, striking, and cracking stone created a layered pattern of sound that echoed softly against the quarry walls throughout the day. As work continued, small movements slowly altered the shape of the quarry itself. A worker crouched beside a narrow cut in the limestone and cleared loose debris using his hands before guiding a copper blade deeper into the stone surface. Nearby, another group poured water along thin cracks to weaken sections of rock prepared for separation. Several men pushed wooden wedges into carefully carved openings, while others stepped backward to study how fractures spread across the block beneath pressure. Occasionally, a sharp cracking sound signaled that part of the limestone had finally broken free from the quarry floor. Dust rose briefly through the warm air before settling again across tools, baskets, and tired shoulders bent toward the next stage of labor. For many workers, life inside the quarry may have created a different understanding of the pyramids than the vision carried by rulers or priests. The monument existed for them not as a distant symbol of eternity, but as physical effort repeated hour after hour against resistant stone. Their attention focused upon weight, balance, fractures, and endurance beneath exhausting conditions shaped by heat and repetition. Looking upward from the quarry floor, some workers may have seen only narrow sections of sky framed by towering limestone walls scarred by years of cutting. Yet within those confined spaces, the first material foundations of the pyramids slowly emerged through ordinary labor carried out by countless hands across many passing seasons. Early each morning, long before the strongest sunlight reached the quarry floor, workers descended narrow paths cut into the limestone, carrying their tools across their shoulders. Some brought copper chisels wrapped in linen cloth, while others balanced wooden mallets and baskets used for clearing broken stone. The quarry revealed layers of pale rock exposed through years of cutting, with vertical faces marked by old extraction lines left behind by earlier crews. Thin cracks spread naturally through parts of the limestone, guiding workers towards sections easier to separate from the surrounding bedrock. Nearby, unfinished blocks rested partly attached to the quarry floor, where previous labor had paused at the end of another exhausting day beneath the desert sky. The physical experience inside the quarry changed steadily as the morning progressed. Cooler air trapped within the lower excavation areas slowly gave way to growing heat reflected from the limestone walls surrounding the workers. Dust gathered quickly around moving feet and clung to damp skin after repeated labor with hammer and chisel. The sound of copper scraping stone carried sharply through the enclosed space, sometimes followed by the deeper noise of cracking rock as wedges forced pressure into prepared cuts. Workers paused occasionally to wipe sweat from their faces or drink water from clay jars resting in shaded corners beside the quarry paths. The smell of broken limestone lingered constantly in the air, mixing with traces of leather bindings, wooden handles, and sun-warmed linen clothing. Throughout the day, the rhythm of labor unfolded through many small coordinated actions rather than dramatic moments. One worker knelt beside a partially cut block and carefully deepened a narrow channel running along its edge. Nearby, another group inserted wooden wedges into prepared openings before pouring water across the dry, so it would slowly expand within the stone. Several men used baskets to carry loose debris away from active cutting areas, while others inspected the surface of newly exposed limestone, searching for hidden fractures that might weaken future blocks. Progress emerged gradually through patience and repetition. Each separated stone required countless controlled strikes, measured adjustments, and quiet attention shared among workers familiar with the difficult behavior of limestone beneath pressure. For the men laboring within the quarry, time may have felt closely tied to the repetitive movement of the body rather than the passing of seasons or ceremonies above ground. Days unfolded through familiar physical routines shaped by lifting, cutting, clearing, and observing stone under changing light. The pyramids themselves remained distant from immediate view, yet every extracted block carried the future shape of those monuments within its heavy form. Some workers may have taken quiet satisfaction in recognizing strong stone ready for transport, while others perhaps focused only on enduring another day beneath the quarry walls. Their labor rarely invited public recognition, yet the immense structures rising at Giza depended entirely upon the steady rhythm of work unfolding deep inside these dusty excavations. By midday, the quarry floor carried a brighter and harsher light as sunlight reached deeper into the excavation through the open space above. The limestone walls reflected pale heat back toward the workers, surrounding them with surfaces marked by tool scars, chipped edges, and unfinished cuts running in long straight lines through the rock. Loose fragments of stone covered much of the ground, forcing careful steps between work areas where partially freed blocks rested inside carved channels. Wooden sledges waited near the upper paths beside thick ropes coiled for later transport. In some sections of the quarry, workers had cut narrow stairways directly into the limestone walls so crews could move between different levels of excavation without climbing unstable piles of debris. The atmosphere inside the quarry became heavier during these hotter hours. Dust rose continuously beneath hammer strikes and drifted through shafts of sunlight descending from above. Workers breathed through dry mouths, while fine limestone powder settled against their lips, eyelashes, and forearms. The sound of metal scraping rock echoed sharply through the enclosed excavation, blending with the dull impact of wooden mallets, striking wedges deeper into prepared cuts. Some men wrapped linen cloth across their noses to reduce the dust entering their lungs, though the fabric itself quickly turned pale beneath the constant exposure to powdered stone. Nearby, clay jars standing in narrow shaded areas offered brief relief through warm water that carried a faint taste of earth and limestone. Small changes unfolded steadily across the quarry as workers advanced through different stages of extraction. One crew gathered around a deep cut running beneath a large stone block, while another carefully widened a channel using repeated controlled strikes against the limestone surface. Several men pushed wooden levers beneath loosened sections of rock and tested whether the block had separated fully from the quarry floor. Nearby, workers carried broken debris away in baskets balanced against their shoulders, clearing space for future cutting. Occasionally, a block shifted slightly with a low grinding sound that caused nearby crews to pause and study the movement before continuing. Progress often depended upon these cautious moments where observation mattered as much as physical strength. For many laborers within the quarry, the repetitive work may have created a quiet awareness of how human effort slowly reshaped the earth itself. The walls surrounding them had once been solid, uninterrupted stone stretching beneath the desert surface. Yet year after year, the quarry continued opening wider through patient extraction. Workers may not have spoken often about the final monuments rising beyond the excavation, but they likely understood that every polished pyramid block first passed through these harsh conditions of dust, noise, and physical strain. Standing beneath towering quarry walls marked by countless tool cuts, the laborers occupied the hidden beginning of a process that would eventually lift stone into forms associated with kings, eternity, and the distant memory of ancient Egypt. Later in the afternoon, deeper sections of the quarry began falling partly into shadow as the angle of the sun shifted above the excavation. The contrast between bright upper ledges and darker cutting areas below revealed the layered structure of the limestone more clearly. Some sections of rock appeared smooth and pale, while others carried rough textures broken by natural fractures running unevenly through the stone. Along the quarry floor, long rectangular spaces marked where blocks had already been removed and transported away toward the construction grounds near Giza. Wooden ramps built from packed earth and scattered planks connected lower extraction zones to the upper paths, where workers and sledges moved slowly beneath the heavy desert air. The physical strain of labor settled deeply into the bodies of the quarry workers during these later hours. Arms trembled slightly after repeated hammer strikes, while shoulders tightened beneath the effort of lifting stone fragments and carrying loaded baskets across uneven ground. Sweat mixed with limestone dust until skin and clothing carried the same pale color as the quarry walls themselves. The enclosed excavation trapped much of the sound produced by the labor, creating an atmosphere where scraping metal, cracking stone, and shifting debris blended into a constant rough rhythm surrounding the workers from every direction. Even brief pauses beside shaded walls offered limited relief, because fine dust continued drifting through the air and settling across exposed skin and tools. Work progressed through careful coordination between different groups scattered across the quarry. One crew prepared fresh cutting lines across a newly exposed stone surface, while another focused on separating an almost completed block from the bedrock beneath it. Nearby, several workers positioned thick wooden levers beneath the edges of loosened limestone and applied steady pressure together rather than sudden force. A low splitting sound spread through the quarry as part of the block shifted slightly upward from the floor. Men nearby stopped their own labor for a moment to watch the movement before returning to their tasks. Elsewhere, younger workers swept loose debris aside using rough brushes made from bundled reeds, opening cleaner pathways between active cutting areas and transport ramps. For those who spent much of their lives inside the quarry, the repeated routines of extraction may have shaped a quiet sense of endurance, connected more closely to labor than to glory. Their days revolved around the physical behavior of stone, the durability of tools, and the changing condition of their own bodies beneath exhausting conditions. The pyramids above ground would eventually attract attention through size and beauty, yet the quarry workers remained tied to the hidden beginning of that process, where beauty first emerged through dust, strain, and controlled effort. Looking across the carved walls surrounding them, some laborers may have recognized how deeply human ambition depended upon ordinary workers willing to spend years transforming rough stone into the foundations of something far larger than themselves. As evening moved closer across the desert, the quarry slowly took on softer colors beneath the lowering sunlight. Pale limestone surfaces that earlier reflected harsh brightness now carried warmer shades of yellow and faded orange along the cut walls. Shadows stretched deeper into the lower excavation areas, covering piles of broken debris and partially freed blocks resting beside narrow extraction channels. Dust suspended in the air became more visible within the angled light, drifting slowly through the quarry before settling across tools, ramps, and scattered baskets left beside active work zones. Along the upper edges of the excavation, workers moved in small groups toward transport paths where ropes, sledges, and prepared stone blocks waited for the next stage of labor beyond the quarry itself. The physical atmosphere shifted gradually as the strongest heat of the day weakened. Cooler currents of air occasionally passed through the quarry and carried relief to workers whose bodies had spent long hours beneath reflected sunlight and drifting dust. The smell of broken limestone remained heavy near active cutting areas, though traces of smoke from cooking fires beginning near the workers' camps drifted faintly into the excavation from beyond the quarry edge. Hands roughened by tools loosened their grip as labor slowed, and many workers stretched stiff shoulders or wiped layers of pale dust from their faces using damp cloths. Around the quarry, the sharp rhythm of hammer strikes became less constant, replaced by quieter sounds of movement, conversation, and the scraping of debris cleared from pathways before nightfall. Activity during these final hours focused less on cutting fresh stone and more on preparing the quarry for the following day. Several workers inspected blocks separated earlier from the limestone floor, checking edges for cracks that might weaken the stone during transport. Nearby, crews secured ropes around finished blocks positioned beside ramps leading upward toward the plateau. Younger laborers gathered tools scattered across the excavation and carried baskets filled with broken fragments away from the active work zones. In one lower section of the quarry, a small group poured water into deep cuts left unfinished, hoping the moisture would soften weaker layers of limestone before work resumed at sunrise. The pace slowed steadily, though careful attention continued shaping even the smallest tasks performed before darkness arrived. For many quarry workers, the end of the day may have carried a mixture of physical exhaustion and quiet familiarity rather than dramatic emotion. The routines of cutting, lifting, clearing, and observing stone repeated themselves across seasons until labor itself became woven into the rhythm of daily life. Yet beneath that routine, the workers likely understood that the stone blocks surrounding them would eventually stand high above the desert within monuments meant to outlive kingdoms and generations. Their own names would rarely be remembered beside those structures, though their labor remained hidden inside every polished surface and aligned wall. Within the dusty quarry, the foundations of eternity first passed through ordinary human hands shaped by repetition, patience, and endurance. Night gradually settled over the quarry as the final light disappeared from the upper limestone ledges and deeper excavation areas faded into shadow. The pale stone walls that had reflected bright heat throughout the day now carried cooler tones beneath the darkening sky. Tools rested beside unfinished cuts where workers had paused their labor until morning. Ramps leading upward from the quarry stood quiet except for occasional figures moving slowly toward the camps with baskets, ropes, or empty water jars balanced against tired shoulders. In several places, large limestone blocks remained positioned beside extraction channels where they had been separated from the bedrock earlier that afternoon. Even in darkness, the quarry revealed signs of long, continuous labor carved deeply into the desert earth. The nighttime atmosphere inside the excavation felt different from the harsh conditions of daylight hours. Cooler air settled gradually along the quarry floor and softened some of the dryness carried through the heat of the day. Fine limestone dust still coated clothing, skin, and hair, though the drifting wind now moved it gently across the ground instead of lifting it heavily into the air. Near the workers' camps above the quarry, cooking fires released smells of grain, roasted onions, and smoke that traveled downward through the evening darkness. Quiet conversations carried across the excavation while workers cleaned tools, rubbed sore hands, or washed dust from their faces using water carefully preserved in clay containers after the long labor of extraction. Although much of the quarry entered rest after sunset, certain forms of activity continued beneath the night sky. Several experienced workers inspected blocks prepared for transport at first light, checking rope bindings and wooden supports placed beneath the heavy stone. Nearby, another group repaired damaged tool handles by firelight, while younger laborers sorted copper chisels according to wear and sharpness. Along one quarry wall, a worker used a small oil lamp to examine cracks inside a partially cut block abandoned earlier in the day after signs of weakness appeared within the stone. These quieter tasks unfolded without urgency, yet remained important to the steady rhythm of quarry life. Even during rest hours, preparation for future labor continued shaping the routines of those who work there. For the quarry workers, night may have offered the only hours when attention could move briefly away from stone itself. The darkness above the excavation revealed stars scattered across the Egyptian sky, far beyond the quarry walls surrounding their daily labor. Some workers may have looked upward and thought about the immense structures rising from the plateau nearby, built slowly from blocks cut by hands like their own. Others perhaps focused only on recovering strength for the next morning when hammer, chisel, and dust would once again define the rhythm of the day. Yet within those ordinary cycles of labor, the quarry workers quietly shaped materials that would become part of monuments remembered long after the sounds of their tools had faded into history. The stone is cut. The blocks are ready. Thousands of tons of limestone lie waiting in the dark, silent and immovable. But a terrifying question remains. How do you move a mountain across a desert where even a single step is a struggle? Tomorrow, we witness the impossible. We reveal the lost technology of the sledges and the secret liquid that turned the friction of the sand into a pathway for the gods. The journey to the summit has only just begun.